I do know that there's something very important at the centre of this work that many, many people are working on around the world. I had a niggling question as to why it was that seed laws were being passed and seed laws were being changed. Just after the war in Iraq in 2005, I became aware of the fact that while everybody was talking about the oil, there was actually a patent order passed on seeds as part of a 100 orders 5 days before the Coalition Provisional Authority left Iraq. And that Order 81 was to patent the seeds for the first time in what is actually ancient Mesopotamia, where farming first began. And that made me question, why was that? What was the interest in seeds? And it meant that seeds were actually very, very important. And it coincided with me having dug up the back garden in our house in Kildare and having grown 5 different varieties of peas from the beloved Irish Seedsavers, who had just begun in the 1990s, and discovered that this Irish green pea that I was growing was way more bountiful and resilient than all the other peas that I was growing. I think that common sense tells us a lot of things. One of the clear lessons from my own back garden was, what is this pea that can be more bountiful? This heritage variety that's no longer commercially available? What is it in the DNA of this particular pea that makes that possible? And then to discover that actually that pea seed was saved by Nikolai Vavilov, the father of biodiversity, in the 1920s in Russia, or on his expeditions across the world. He went all over the world gathering seeds and bringing them back. And thanks to Seedsavers here, they repatriated a lot of the Irish seed varieties that were lost to us so that we could grow them again. Now that's actually a very important thing. 2 things at the one time. I was discovering the bounty of forgotten seeds at the same time as realising that seed laws and seed patents were being passed in other countries and other jurisdictions. And it made me question, well, is this happening elsewhere? And because of the dangers of, if you like, investigating these kind of laws in the likes of Iraq and Afghanistan, I decided to look at Ethiopia, which was one of the centres of origin of key crop varieties that Vavilov had identified. Ethiopia, as it is ancient Abyssinia, coffee is endemic to the region. Barley, it's a secondary place of evolution, hugely important for the local population for keeping famine at bay. And so I decided to concentrate on East Africa. A lot of people are sort of saying the world has been overrun by globalisation, that globalisation is hollowing out the state, that we no longer have any power, and that in a way that the state has been sort of sidetracked by huge conglomerates of other interests, transnational actors and big transnational corporations who are clearly wielding huge power on the planet. But to look at Kenya, I definitely could see from the law that it is very much a hyper-globalised law, that those forces got their way in the making of this law. Because the questions that I asked were, who wrote the law? What were the motivations of the people who wrote the law? Who was consulted? It's not just about the seeds themselves, it's actually about the politics, because politics determines who gets what, where, when, and how. And those are the questions that I had to ask in terms of who wrote the law, what were their motivations in determining this. The results of that are quite interesting in the context of what happened in Ethiopia, because in Ethiopia, which is a much more authoritarian state, there was actually a much less globalised law, because the public institutions in Ethiopia were actually consulted at the beginning. There was actually a very important exemption included in the Ethiopian law, which allowed for farmers' seeds and farmers' seed varieties and biodiversity to be actually enshrined, to be protected, and that they did not have to comply with the bigger commercial law. Now, that's extremely important for anybody who's interested in how legal incursions or the globalisation of law is actually affecting us in our domestic situations and at a local level as well. I'm asserting that there are transformative possibilities abounding at the moment for us to actually in some way reform or transform globalisation. Literally before I came out today, I got a message from Ethiopia from the leading plant physiologist who I'd worked with when I was there. He's basically saying we're actually literally on a knife edge at the moment of the loss of our seed varieties, of our own farmers' varieties, that they're facing a locust plague in the north of Ethiopia at the moment. These are the conditions that they operate under. And they're saying if this kind of uniformization, like uniform seeds that are just based for monoculture, for commercial interest, this is not a hysterical scientist. This is somebody who was actually consulted as the former head of the Ethiopian Biodiversity Institute and a member of the Convention on Biological Diversity. All the time that I was meeting him, right through from the beginning of the drafting of the Ethiopian law, he was saying, if we lose our farmers' seeds, we're not doing this because we're environmentalists or conservationists, as you think of in the West. We are doing this because if these seeds disappear, so do we. It is that inextricably linked for them. There's 96% of their seed varieties are open pollinated varieties. They're non-commercially available. They absolutely rely upon the informal, non-commoditized seed exchange between one another across huge agrarian societies. This is an important moment because it means that we actually now know exactly who they are, exactly their motivations. And some of their motivations, by the way, are actually noble. I think that some of these people actually think that they're pulling people out of poverty. But the only thing is, there are other huge conventions who've been doing work for quite a long time who understand that maybe it can't just be where there's a book in it. Agroecology was deleted from both of these recent laws in Ethiopia and Kenya. This is where the claims are made that these huge, giant philanthrocapitalists, as I call them, venture capitalists, and transnational corporations, this is where they claim that they are feeding the hungry. And that is not what is happening. The implications and the repercussions of these seed laws is actually going to be very, very detrimental to the populations. We understand a thing or two about inherited trauma in this country because we experienced a famine here, where 1 million of our people starved and 1 million emigrated, a demographic that was not changed until recent years. So we actually have it in our own memory bank, the understanding of what it actually means to lose a whole part of a rich, diverse peasant class of a society. And these are the people who are writing to us today. And this is what Ragasa Faisa sent me today. The seed systems are getting weakened due to lack of technical and financial as well as policy support, while the genetic resources of our farmers' varieties are locked out of the interest scene of policies and investment. It is not a matter of dispute that erosion of both our crop genetic diversity and farmers' seed systems is one of the causes for loss of plenty of food sources with its direct impact on local and national food security. It is evident that there is a direct link between the declining investment on diversification as well as on our local seed system, and a decline in agricultural productivity and food security. Nevertheless, it is our smallholders, our food-producing farmers, who produce over 96% of the seed and planting materials for the country, and of course the food on which our nation lives. I do hope that people read the book and that they criticise it, trash it, do what you want, but talk about this, because we're beginning a conversation tonight that we really need to have. It's only when we have these real conversations, particularly in light of what the likes of Ragasa Faisa and these other people are saying to us, and the kind of messages that we're getting through, that they're saying, please do not forget, we are actually trying desperately to adapt very intelligently and quickly to the things that are happening to us right now. They've started 30 community seed banks right across Ethiopia where they're sharing their seeds with the farming communities right across the country. We need to start doing that ourselves in Ireland. We need to demand of our state that in every county in Ireland we have seeds that are locally adapted to the climate as it's changing. And let it be said tonight, the Green Revolution has failed the planet. 2/3 of the Earth's ecosystems are in danger of collapsing as we speak. We've had 60 years of the so-called Green Revolution, of pesticides, of industrial agriculture, where we're losing farmers in their thousands every single month. Right across Europe even, we're talking about. And yet, the hopeful thing is, these community seed banks at the front line, for the frontline people, they're building community seed banks because they know they are not going to trust the experts who are deleting the agroecology from their seed laws. They're not going to trust the people who are telling them that they should actually walk off their farms and hop on a boat and become migrants in other countries. Because it's actually dismantling agrarian systems that are actually have been holding the planet together. So I think that this is one of the things that we really, really do need to assess what's actually happening and what the implications are.
This is a marvellous work of academic research, a marvellous work of explaining to us through the story of seed sovereignty the forces that now we face and must confront. Clare is telling the story of life itself and where we now find ourselves against the background of what is happening in Ethiopia and Kenya. And what is the interest that is being protected? And her questions about law should strike every lawyer like a bolt. Who is making the law? What is its purpose? And where is it coming from? Any system of law bubbles up from the people, is an expression of their equality, expresses itself horizontally for the good of all of the people. It doesn't come down on top of us, either at best beneficence or at worst oppression. And that's the hope for Ethiopia, for Kenya, and for all of us, that the people will express themselves through the basic law, and that expression in constitutions and other fundamental documents, even international documents, that will be the bulwark against the onward march of globalisation, global capitalism. The neoliberal idea, the be-all and the end-all, the all-knowing, all-solving market, if you can let that rip, some good will emerge. That's a measure of the fanaticism of the neoliberals. There hasn't been a time in history where humankind, I suggest, has identified power like that and said, let it rip. They have said, as we have always said, we must contain the power. And that's by strong, fundamental law. We must give all our people the law to contain the power, and then you have the space of activism. How can we work together for the greater good of all? It's not just a bad thing to ignore what the people say in relation to the production of seed in Ethiopia and Kenya and Ireland and anywhere else. It's a madness. It's a waste of resource. We need the metal of ideas. Everybody from every centre of interest and learning and practice and experience saying, this is how I see it. That's the only way out of this. I think this is a powerful book. It's the story of life itself. It's a profound intervention at this particular moment, and it gives us the foundation for an analysis of just what exactly we face, what exactly is going on. To make this case for how we are at this particular time, to identify the forces that have to be confronted and engaged in dialogue, well, it indicates a reverence for nature, an empathy with it, an interconnectedness with it. And the highest compliment I can pay to Clare, I kept thinking of a story I had read where the transmission of all that was in the world was made wordlessly with the product of a seed. When a flower was held up, no words were spoken, and from the Buddha came the first transmission of the Dharma. And I think there's something that profound almost in this book, and that's the highest compliment I can pay.
I think it's an incredibly important issue, an incredibly important subject, and I suppose as somebody who has spent most of my adult life working around issues to do with famine and food security and hunger, to me this seems like a book that has been crying out to be written. And I think the great thing is that it has been written by Clare O Grady Walshe. I've read it and it's a work of genius. As I was reading the book, I was thinking about a great African friend of ours and the patron of Afri, a man called Desmond Tutu, who came to Dublin at our invitation in 1984 and spoke to a crowded meeting in Sean McDermott Street. But one of the things he said I have always remembered is that he said, food is not an accident. It is a result of political and economic decisions. And I think if anyone has any doubts about that, reading this book by Clare will convince us of that position.
While these great forces influence accessibility, the actual ability comes from a different place, and they must go together. I think Clare's work, which I saw how hard she worked to do that inside, outside, it was such a dedication, complete dedication. And what she's produced, I think, is a foundation stone for actually trying to understand the complexity on a level where people just glass over and go, oh, it's just too much. And she's broken it down so it's not too much. It's really clear how all these pieces play. They don't really fit together, so there's no puzzle that works, but at least the pieces are clear. And I think for political policy going forward, this has to make a huge difference. I met a young Scottish farmer who got 7,000 wheat varieties out of a gene bank and is throwing them into a field and seeing how they're mixing what will work in a rainy Scottish valley. A Swede farmer in Ireland who spent 5 years, again, doing his own breeding program, trying to find the Swede that will work now. Same in Clough-Jordan with onions. So people on the ground, the work with seed is compulsively creative. The passion is always in growers and people who work with nature. And I think that never dies, actually. So it's all about accessibility. It's all about accessibility, and I think Clare's work is going to really help protect accessibility.
I'm delighted to be here, really, and only Afri and Clare O Grady Walshe could organise an event like this here. I consider Clare as one of my closest friends. Clare has been someone who has been enormously supportive of me in particular. Clare's reputation as an activist is very well known. She's somebody who is very powerful in terms of what she believes in and how she delivers that. And you don't have to look back at 26 years of age, director of Greenpeace Ireland, and so on and so on. She's travelled across the world campaigning for this planet of ours. This book, every word, every paragraph, every page represents Clare's passion. And Clare has all that passion, all that commitment, all that enthusiasm to do her bit to change the world.
SDG 2 on hunger is stagnant, and over the last 3 years, if anything, we're seeing fallbacks in reaching that SDG. And in the context when 1 in 5 people in Africa are suffering from undernutrition or malnutrition, books like this are even more important. This is the first time that these case studies have been written for Kenya and Ethiopia, and that's extremely important to us. And these are countries where Trócaire work and where we support small-scale farmers using agroecological approaches, those approaches you've talked about, to bring about more resilience and responding to climate change and climate crisis that we face. And for these farmers, seed rights play such an important role in strengthening their resilience. Clare's book highlights how climate change threatens seed sovereignty. It's a human rights issues for farmers to be able to grow, to develop, to save, to store, to reuse, and to exchange and sell their own variants of seeds, a very basic fundamental human right. It's the right of farmers to determine their seeds that they want to grow, their own choice of seeds that they want to grow, and also their right to reject certain seeds that they think are dangerous for economic reasons, for ecological reasons, for also cultural reasons that these seeds are dangerous. And it's about farmers and other actors retaining their sovereignty in the face of globalisation and what we're facing. Farmers and small community-based organisations are so often excluded from these processes and very deliberately excluded from these processes. These processes, decision-making around making laws, are top-down, closed processes. And essentially this is something that's extremely concerning to us. At the risk of insulting any of the academics here, I think the real test of research is in its application and in how it can be used and what change and difference it can make. And I can say that already we have shared these case studies with our colleagues in Ethiopia and our colleagues in Kenya and our colleagues in other countries, and they will be using them in their advocacy.
Clare, had to become an insider and go to some actual fields. It's actually the only field work I've heard of in my school where somebody went to a field. But I think that shows you that, that she had to take the view of like the Ethiopian farmers, which is like a huge sort of imaginative leap. And then she also had to get some distance
from something that she cared so passionately about. Values can motivate our questions in social science, but the answers are supposed to come from logic and evidence. And Clare did that, and the logic and evidence pointed to something called transformational sovereignty. And transformational sovereignty is a situation where there's a space for activism, because it's a reconfiguration of sovereignty and of power where there's space for the public sector, the private sector, local, regional, national, and international. And there's space for activism in there. And that's not Clare's hope, that's not Clare's past, that's logic and evidence has given us, if you like, this way forward and this hope in terms of the politics of biodiversity.
Meeting Clare was one of those sort of moments where at last, after many years of sitting in rooms discussing how one would share genetic resources in the world, here was somebody who was fired up to do something about it. We take seeds for granted. If you go up to Dublin Zoo, you cannot come home with a giraffe in your pocket. But if you pop up to the Botanic Gardens, as long as I don't catch you, well, you can pick a seed off any plant and you can bring it home and grow it in your own garden. So there's an incredible ability for plants to get around not only the country they live in, but the world. And any of us can travel anywhere overseas and we can bring back a handful of seeds in our pocket. And one of the things that people have been looking at for many years is how do we ensure that countries of origin have some sort of control over their seeds? And when we think about farmers working in fields all around the world, developing these crops, like Anita has said, you can't just say, well, you just throw the seed there. Actually, you need that complexity of the grower and the plant to make sure you get a crop from it. How do we ensure we protect what is so important to us? Our relationship with these plants is critical to our survival. And the sadness that we have now commodified not only property, buildings we live in, food crops, almost everything becomes commodified, and then it exceeds what it was meant to do. We are meant to have this relationship with living on this planet. Some years ago, I was wondering about the idea of what if I took one seed off every species of plant in this country and just the native flora of Ireland. There are 840 species of plant that grow naturally in Ireland. And if you took one seed from each of those 840 species and put them together, what would it look like? I thought, well, maybe it'll look like a small orange in size. The answer was, it looks like that. And I'll pass this around the room, but our entire native flora can be fit inside a matchbox. It gives you an idea of just how miraculous seeds are. They are something that is of immense significance to our civilization. And the importance of this book is that we can now realize the complexity of these arguments. How do we protect the significance of farmers growing a crop in the mountains of Ethiopia to our globalized world? It is a wonderful moment, I think, in history that a Joan of Arc has arisen, if you like, that Greta Thunberg has suddenly focused the entire world's attention on the importance of where the human race is sitting right now and where our future is.
Well, I'm sorry that I can't be here in person, because I was hoping very much to meet you all and talk with you, but unfortunately I've become very enfeebled, so I have to stay at home. Yes, I mean, this is a really, really important book. I greatly enjoyed reading it. Was awed by the amount of serious hard work that had gone into the research. Absolutely huge. The subject is so important that I feel it shouldn't be limited by academic lingo. There were so many memories to do with my seeing the extraordinary skill of farmers in several African countries and in Laos, in Nepal many years ago. And then in Laos, I remember seeing it being just as it happens while I was there, the actual program was being introduced by a multinational company to completely transform their way of growing rice, which they have been growing for at least 3,000 years. And I remember staying in one village and my host explaining to me that within that small area they actually used 27 different varieties of rice seed. It was according to the gradient of the land, the direction of the wind, the rainfall, the amount of sunshine or not, depending on they have one mountain shaded another. Every single little detail they were fully aware of, and hence the extraordinary variety of seeds being used. And then the thought of these experts arriving and telling them that no, they could get far higher yields if they were to use the imported seeds. Then later, a few years later, I heard that there had been a sad, tragic migration of these villagers from that particular area because the imported seeds just weren't working. They were becoming impoverished, living on the edges of a river-level town and hoping that they could somehow retrieve their fortunes there. Really, really sad story. So anyway, I hope that this book, which shows the potential for opposing climate change by the careful use of seeds, all these traditional farmers all over the world, they'll be the ones who will adapt most rapidly and intelligently to climate change. They're not sitting there waiting for some expert to come along and tell them, this is what you must do. They know very well what they must do. If a season was turning out not quite as they had hoped, how they would, instead of giving up and thinking, oh God, this is just going to be a bad season, they would quickly adapt, plant another crop, because of course they had the available seeds all stored and ready for use. So good luck and congratulations to Clare.